The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
Good evening and welcome to Ask a Reporter, the live meetup series where Los Angeles Times journalists discuss the news and answer your questions about current events and the stories that we're covering. I'm Sandy Banks and I'm a Los Angeles Times columnist. Tonight we're going to be discussing the reopenings of schools across Los Angeles, everything from hybrid learning to coronavirus concerns to the new schedules that families have to adapt to. I'll be joined by three of my colleagues who cover education for the Los Angeles Times. I'd like to introduce them now. Paloma Esquivel is a member of the Times reporting team who won a Pulitzer Prize in 2011, the Public Service Award for stories that she's working on. She's now a member of the education team covering schools across Los Angeles, K through 12. We have Howard Bloom, who is a veteran education reporter. He can tell you anything that you need to know about K through 12 schools all across Los Angeles. And we have Sonia Sharp, who recently launched our 8 to 3 newsletter, which is a new online service resource that's going to be able to give parents all the information they need and things they don't even know that they need and want to read. So we thank you all for joining us and welcome you, and we look forward to hearing from you as we go on through the program. Well, first, I want to kick things off by looking at the early days of the return to school. I know it hasn't been very long, but it seems from our coverage that the schools have very different experiences depending on where they're located in Los Angeles in terms of how many students are coming back and how prepared they are. Why do the school reopenings look different in places? We have West Side and West San Fernando Valley, where a lot of people are coming back, and then we have many communities in the East Side where very few students are coming. And I know, Paloma, that you have been out at schools and you have been talking to people. What have you found? What accounts for the vast differences?
Yeah, thanks. I think that the answer to that question is complicated, right? There's no one single reason why some parents are choosing to send their kids back to school and other parents are not. But I think it's clear from our reporting and from other reporting around the country that a big factor in which communities have larger rates of students returning to school, for example, communities on the West Side where elementary school students are returning at about an 82% rate compared to communities on the East Side where they're returning at a 36% rate. And one of the big factors there is the different experience of the pandemic. Communities on the East Side, communities in Pico Union, Southgate, Watts, you have a death rate that's 10 times higher sometimes in some cases than it is in communities on the West Side. So that's definitely one big factor. There are a lot of others. Some of it has to do with scheduling. If you're a working parent and you're trying to work around the limited schedules that schools have right now, that's incredibly challenging. So that's another issue. But that issue of the different experiences that communities have had with the coronavirus is really a big factor.
You recently wrote a story that was very well read about this subject. When you were doing the reporting, what kind of mood did you sense among parents? What concerns did they have? And were they different depending on the community?
Yeah, I think definitely. Maybe Howard can talk about his experience at Warner Elementary in Westwood, but in our story that we reported, it's sort of this jubilant excitement about being back on campus, and 95% of students are going back to the school. It's just this, it was time, we needed to be back, and we're so excited and happy and ready to be back. And then you go, I went to some schools in Southgate and a school in Watts, and it's just a different experience. You have classrooms where there's 2 or 3 students. There is a lot of concern when you speak with parents who have not sent their kids back. There's a lot of concern about, do I trust my child's school to be able to take those safety measures that are necessary to keep them safe, and also especially to keep them from not bringing the coronavirus possibly back to older family members, to multi-generational households. So yeah, I think there was definitely different moods in different communities.
What did you find, Howard, at Warner? Is it a question of people trusting their schools, or what did you sense when you did your reporting there?
Well, I think Paloma has covered it pretty well. I don't know that people trust their schools anymore on the West Side, but I think people feel that the danger from the pandemic doesn't feel as present to them. Also, there's a much higher vaccination rate on the West Side and in more prosperous communities in general, and that makes a difference. Another thing, so I guess what one thing is that on the West Side, you're more likely to encounter people who say that there are excessive safety measures. You're more likely to hear people say, why can't we go to school full time 5 days a week? These safety measures that the school district is putting in are effectively preventing us from doing this, forcing a part time schedule on us. And there are a lot of people who object to that. You will find all viewpoints in every community. So it's just trends that we're noting. There's also a difference by age. The younger kids are more likely to be returning to schools than the older kids. And some of that is that parents desperately need the child care for their younger children. Another factor is that parents are less satisfied with what the district is offering at the middle and high school level. At the middle and high school level, in order to keep a small cohort of students together, they're essentially having students return to school and log into Zoom or log into whatever they're logging into online, just as they would have when they were at home. And they put on headphones. Every student in the classroom is working on something else. The teacher is teaching students who aren't in the room online. Whereas in elementary school, you are being taught by the teacher in front of you for the most part, unless that teacher has a medical exemption. So all of those factors come into play.
Are the schools doing anything to raise the numbers in areas that are low, or to accommodate parents who are unhappy with the system the way it is?
They are definitely trying to raise the numbers because they feel that the best place for most kids is in a classroom on campus, even at the middle and high school level. So they are promoting the fact that, hey, come to campus, you'll get great Wi-Fi here. You will at least be in person with people, even if you're working on headphones on your own work. There are 2 periods a day where the students and the teacher get to interact directly on campus, and they do some sort of non-academic activity. And that may not seem like much, but the school district finds this to be a good mental health check-in for students. So they are actively promoting everywhere the superintendent goes. He is filming videos where he says, come back, join these students, it's safe. At the same time, they do recognize that everybody has their own family dynamic, and they want to respect the individual choice of families.
Can people keep coming back as the time goes on, or is there a deadline that you have to sign up and come back, or not?
Officially, you can change your mind every 2 weeks. But the truth is they're trying to accommodate people even more frequently than that. Now, one hitch is that you do have to have a coronavirus test. So if you're not willing to take that, then they're not going to let you in. And some parents have complained about that. You also have to have a coronavirus test each week, which is an enormous undertaking. And it's mostly working, but there have been some reports where the infrastructure is not working yet so that families can get their test results on a timely basis. And some students have missed a few days of school because of that.
All right, thank you, Howard. Sonia, you've spent a lot of time with our very youngest students. And because of online learning this year, a lot of the kindergartners this year have never spent any time in a classroom. And a lot of parents did not enroll their children in kindergarten this year. So now we will be facing, in the next school year, a lot of first graders with very little experience in the classroom. Is the district planning to do anything about that, or what would be the consequences of that?
Well, Sandy, I think you're exactly right. This is a big question because we know, right? Kids come to kindergarten with already kind of really on 2 tracks with vastly different experiences. To qualify for public preschool can currently get it. That was pre-pandemic. And so poorer kids are much more likely to come to kindergarten having never been in a classroom before. Now, kids who would have spent their first year in a classroom as kindergartners are going to go to first grade having never been in a classroom before. And even though kindergarten is so much more academic than maybe when you or I were in it, it's still so much of what's done in kindergarten is learning how to line up, learning how to take turns, learning how to raise your hand to do things. The very basics, learning what a bell schedule is, just very, very basic things about being in a classroom that are extremely hard to teach remotely, right? And so these kids, and we also know, you mentioned Howard's reporting from last fall about the number of kindergartners who just simply never showed up and who were kind of expected and didn't end up in classrooms. And those kids also predominantly came from poorer neighborhoods. So again, it's that double hit of having not had any classroom exposure before and then entering first grade, which is so very academic, right? So much of the foundation of literacy is being done in first grade. And it's just really not clear right now how all those things will balance out, maybe in a more acute sense than in some of the other grades, although that is obviously a concern at almost every level, is how will kids make up the things that they missed?
Now, that raises the question or the issue that there are so many groups within groups that are going to have particular challenges because of what we've gone through last year. And I know that, Paloma, you did a story on distance learning that looked at English language learners, and they make up 20% of our state students. I think it was 1.1 million, you said. What did you learn about what schools will need to help them go forward? And are they prepared to do that, both financially and resource-wise? What is it going to take for those students to make up ground?
Yeah, I think the thing that I learned is that this is a tremendous challenge for a lot of school districts. English learners have long been, long struggled, in schools, long struggled to get the support that they need, long struggled to get the resources that they need, and that has borne out in sort of big gaps in graduation rates, big gaps in completing the requirements necessary for college, big academic gaps that have long existed. And then you add on top of that this pandemic and the school closures, and not on, distance learning has been a challenge for all kinds of students, all kinds of students. But for English learners in particular, there are very unique challenges that distance learning poses. One of those, especially, is the isolation. How do you learn language in isolation? Mm-hmm. That's a real challenge. In order to be able to learn a language, you have to be able to speak with people, and for students, a lot of that happens, on the playground, in the classroom with their teachers, in the classroom with their peers as they're talking. And so many students have been stripped of that it poses a real challenge. A lot of the experts that I spoke to are calling for extra time, in the classroom. They're calling for extra attention to those families that choose to continue on with distance learning, who don't come back, because again, sort of going back to the topic that we talked about earlier, right? In heavily Latino, heavily immigrant communities, the rate of return back to in-person learning is lower. So you have to continue to address the needs of English learners who choose to remain distance learning. They're calling for extra school days, extra time in the summer, just a lot of intensive extra support. Whether that will happen, I guess, is the question that we'll have to answer as time goes on. These decisions, for the most part, are made district by district. And so it comes down to what are the district's priorities, and how much time and effort are they going to spend on working specifically and finding solutions for this group of students.
It seems likely then that these students have not only missed the opportunity to learn in English, but they may be losing ground because they haven't had the opportunity to practice and to use what they know. Is that true? Is that what they have seen? I don't know if they've even tested or done any assessments yet, but does that seem like a possibility that they'll be further
absolutely.
behind?
Yeah, I spoke with a family where, it was a family that had come to the U.S. from Ecuador, I think it was like 3 years ago. And they have a 10-year-old son, and he struggled with English at first, but he was making ground. He was, at the more time that he spent in the schools, he was starting to learn. He was starting to pick up. And, I spoke to him and to his parents, and they all said, this just being at home, with other people who don't speak the language, I'm going backwards. I'm not learning the way I should be learning. So yeah, it's absolutely a challenge.
Oh, all right. Well, the hybrid teaching model too doesn't seem to maybe serve them that well. But let me ask you, Howard. I know you know a lot about this. That's going to be offered for the remainder of this year, and I know it's got its pluses and minuses. But what do educators think about it, and experts, and what do the families that you talk to think about it?
Well, first of all, a hybrid, as I hope most parents would know by now, but maybe not all viewers, hybrid means that you spend part of your time on campus and part of your time you're still doing distance learning from home. And there is an argument to be made that in some cases, hybrid, if you're not doing it well, could be worse than distance-only learning. There's also a concern that as districts move into these hybrid plans, that the families who are still in distance learning only may receive less attention and focus. And there are many families, in fact, most families, after all, have chosen not to go back at this point. But it is still a transition back into regular full-time learning. And it's different in every place. In LA Unified, for example, the elementary students go back to campus 5 days a week, but it is for half a day. And then the rest of that school day, they're expected to be online, learning on their computers, or doing some other kind of work to make up the rest of that school day. And at the middle and high school level, it's that Zoom in a room, Zoom in a classroom format, which people are very dissatisfied with it. But then there are places that are changing classes, having middle school and high school that looks a lot like normal middle and high school, except you have smaller classes, a staggered schedule, maybe only half-time schedule. And the trade-off there is maybe it's not as safe. Well, or maybe it is as safe, but parents don't feel as safe and they're not as willing to send their students back. And it's going to be really hard to determine what works best and what isn't working because, frankly, everybody is doing something very different. And that's one of the more interesting things that we found out. But in the end, people want to get their kids back in school full time. They want to do it safely. In the summer in LA Unified, for example, we expect to see hybrid by the fall. The superintendents, the governor, everybody wants there to be full-time instruction in the fall. Some of this will depend on the status of the coronavirus, the status of the pandemic, but that is the goal. And at least until something bad happens, that is also the expectation that school districts will be full-time 5 days a week by the fall.
Is there any research that shows that there is a best way to do hybrid learning, or whether hybrid learning is a plus, has pluses, or whether it's detrimental? Is there any research into that, or has this not been done until now?
Yeah, we haven't really done hybrid education like this, and that kind of research would be hard to carry off because every district has its own hybrid plan. What we do know, based on preliminary research, is that students have suffered during the pandemic, and this will be a test of resilience academically. There are experts who believe that students are very resilient and that they'll actually bounce back very quickly, especially with all these resources. And then there are other experts who are concerned about potential permanent learning loss and how students could be set back for their entire academic career. There's a lot of debate over that.
Sandy,
yes.
If I could jump in, I think it's worth pointing out at LAUSD did this very unique program where they're actually providing on-campus supervision and care for elementary and middle schoolers who want it for the full day. So even though, for example, most elementary school students who've returned to campus will only be with their teacher from 8 o'clock until 11, they can remain on campus until 4 p.m. So for elementary school students, and the vast majority of elementary school students who did return under the hybrid model did also take advantage of this program. So most kids are on campus and they're sort of doing after-school programs essentially with all the same precautions that are in place for regular instruction time. But that does give an opportunity for maybe more socialization, more social emotional work, just kind of getting kids more used to being on campus. I think that is an interesting development that LAUSD did that isn't necessarily common around the country.
That is an interesting development. And it also, I would imagine, makes it easier on some parents who may be able to go back to work or who won't have to worry about childcare.
Absolutely. I think that parents that I spoke to said it just would not be possible to send their kids back at all if it was for just a couple hours every day, or if they had to work around a couple of days schedule. And high school students are old enough they can maybe stay home alone, but these younger kids, it just wasn't workable for families. And I to my understanding, that is why the district offers this.
So they have people on campus that are running that program.
They've hired thousands of people to run that program.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So the schools do seem like they're trying to be creative in ways to both help the students and get them back on campus. But I don't know, from your experience, and I know I think we're polling about this, but what would it take to get high school students back, for instance, to not Zoom in a room, to be able to interact with their teacher? Because they've always been portrayed as the ones that are missing school because they're teenagers and they want to be with their friends. And yet they're going back in the smallest numbers. What would have to happen to get them back? Some of them I would have better going to graduate this year. And you'd think they would want to be rebuilding their bonds and all that. But what accounts for them having such small numbers?
I think that some of this is, there are lots of factors, including some that are very foreboding. I think that there are some students who are some high school age students who are barely in school at all. They may be doing their daily check-in. And by the way, all you have to do to be counted as present right now is to check in live once a day. It could be an email, it could be a brief check-in in the morning, then you can turn your camera off and leave, and you're still counted as present for the day. And that's not unique to LA Unified, I should say. That is the way we're doing attendance this year across the state of California. So at a certain level, attendance numbers are meaningless unless there is follow-up on how much engagement is actually going on. And there is some concern that students are not engaged and that some are not coming back because they've kind of checked out. They've gotten jobs maybe to help their family. They may have babysitting responsibilities for their younger siblings. That's one problem. Obviously, the lack of the richness of the experience. There are no live extracurriculars other than sports. The LA Unified was under a lot of pressure to match what other school systems were doing in sports, and they eventually did that. And therefore, the safety protocols, although they still exist, but they're not strict to the same level in sports, because you all of a sudden you have cohort groups mixing for sports. But they've done that. But other extracurriculars, choir, band, singing, I mean, if you play a musical instrument, you might be better off staying at home, because at home you can play your instrument in your online band class. But if you're doing Zoom in a room at campus, you can't pull out the tuba and start tooting on it, or it's going to create a disruption in the classroom. So there are lots of factors, and there's no consistent polling on what it would take. What the superintendent and what the district is doing is trying to convince people that at least it's safe and that there's some social emotional benefit and the internet is good. And that's the sales pitch. And we'll see if it draws more people in. It could also go the other way, that 1 in 5 students who is coming back may say, there's not much going on here. Maybe I'm going to go back home. We don't know how that's going to play out. It's also near the end of the school year. Maybe people don't want to disrupt their schedules this late into the school year.
But that was surprising to a lot of people, that so late into the school year they decided to change. But that's universal, I guess everyone's doing. Is that just to kind of reward everybody for sticking with you, and here now we're going to get a taste of what's new? And I want to pick up on a point you made before, Howard, about having all this money now because of the pandemic. And are there plans on where to spend it and how to spend it? I know, now that I think, aren't they offering COVID tests or,
Okay, well, to your first question on the timing has to do with allowing teachers to get maximum immunity from the vaccine. So educators in public schools in LA County, except for Long Beach, couldn't really get access to the vaccine before March 1st. And they prioritized the teachers of the younger students first. So we are opening now because that's how long it took teachers to get their full regimen of shots if they chose to do that. So that's really driving the timing. And there are other school districts, other schools, including private schools, that opened sooner because they simply did not wait. There was no requirement that teachers receive full vaccination, but LA Unified was among the other districts that agreed with that policy that was lobbied hard by the teachers union who wanted that. So that governs the amount of timing. As far as testing, coronavirus testing, that's an individual decision of the school district. LA Unified has decided as a confidence building measure and also as a safety measure, they required everybody to take a pre-test before coming back and also everybody to take a weekly test. That includes staff and students, even though presumably virtually all the staff are fully vaccinated, they still have to take their test. Once again, that is not a county requirement. The county, especially at this stage when infection rates are much lower, they are not requiring that. But as LA Unified points out, 90% of the people on a school campus are kids and they are not vaccinated yet. So there's a lot of controversy over these safety measures. There's also a second question in the middle of that I can't remember. But those are your first and third questions.
All right, and that's good because I realize we're getting close to the end. We have viewer questions that we want to get to. So I want to ask one final thing before we're going to bring on our audience engagement editor, Samantha Melbourne Weaver. But before that, I just want to ask you, Sonia, childcare is such a huge issue now on the political side and on the social services side. And the pandemic has kind of changed the debate around childcare about what we need and what people should be entitled to. Can you just talk briefly about what you've seen and heard and what will be maybe different going forward?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Sandy. This is actually what I'm writing about for the newsletter next week. There has been this amazing momentum around ideas of universal childcare. If you heard President Biden's announcement yesterday about the American Families Plan, there is money in there to build out a universal 3 and 4-year-old preschool / pre-K, sort of like what New York City currently has. There's a lot of energy here in California. There's a backup childcare bill that's in the California legislature right now that would ask employers to fund childcare for working parents in certain situations. There is LAUSD, the teachers union asked and received from LAUSD for money for teachers who have young children, because of course a very large number of teachers, not just in LA, but all across California and the nation, have young children, are particularly mothers of young children. And so asked for money for childcare and got about $500 a month, I think, for childcare. And there's just a lot more. It seems much more politically possible. I feel like when Elizabeth Warren was talking about this on the campaign trail, it was kind of like, yeah, sure, okay. And now suddenly we've had these events that just make it so clear what happens to everything when people don't have childcare en masse, and took it from this still sort of private concern, the way we treat it in the United States, to something that feels much more public and that maybe deserves a public answer. So that's something that I've been watching really closely and will continue to report on, including next week.
Well, that's an upside of what we've been through, I think. Then I want to just ask you, Sonia, before we go, to talk about the newsletter and how people can sign up and what they can expect from it.
Right. Well, thanks so much. We launched this newsletter at the beginning of the month. That's 8 to 3. Of course, those are the hours for most of us that our kids are in school, and at least the minimum part of it, right? And so if you are a parent like me, those hours are kind of ruling your life in a lot of ways. And if you're a teacher also, of course, those hours apply to you. this newsletter is designed to be a place for parents to get answers about some of the complex questions. Why do these bureaucracies work this way? How is something actually looking on the ground? One of the questions we started asking ourselves is, as things like birthday parties come back online, if you have young kids, you know that birthday parties are kind of starting to come back. Like, what is the etiquette around doing in-person events or sports, things like that? The intent is really to address, again, this need of, we have for so long treated parenthood as a sort of a private affair. And now, just like with public policy, like, we as a newsroom, we as a society are recognizing that parenting is a huge part of a lot of people's lives, and that it's not really separate from us as workers or, us as public people. It's part of the whole self. And without that element, everything else kind of falls apart. So this newsletter really is for anybody who is interested in those subjects or who has those kind of questions. And you can sign up at LA Times. I think that they have roadblocks and everything now. So if you go and you're not signed up already, you will certainly be encouraged to sign up. And I would encourage you to sign up and send me questions.
Great, thank you. I have a question already, but I hope you'll deal with things like, you have to teach your kids different things now. Like, you want them to be polite and friendly and all that, but what do you do if a kid without a mask comes over and wants to play with you or wants to hug you? And, how do you do that? So there are all these kind of practical things that we're working out on the fly. And the science around that would be helpful, and just hearing from other parents and what they do. So, I think this is a good way to build a community of parents, and an informed community. And also, a lot of parents want to become advocates. They want to become activists now. How do you do that? How do you, who do you call? How do you know how the bureaucracy works? So I am, as a grandmother and the mother of a teacher, I'm grateful that you're going to have this, and look forward to signing up myself. All right, now we are, there's one last question. We're going to have viewers. I promise we're going to get to your things very quickly. But Howard, you mentioned, I can't get over this after the district being always so poor, when you mentioned the district having more money than it knows what to do with. Explain.
That was your second question. That was your second question. So now, now we're good.
Now we're back. Okay. What I want to know is what are they going to do with it, and what are the limitations on it, so we know it's not just a blank check.
Well, it is pretty much a blank check, actually.
Oh.
It's more than $5 billion. Now, that's from the beginning of the pandemic through now. So some of that money has been spent already. But and I should say the district gambled on things like feeding the hungry and a coronavirus testing program when it wasn't sure whether it would be reimbursed for that. And you could argue whether they might indeed be entitled to additional reimbursement based on those efforts. But the bottom line is they've got a lot of money to figure out how to spend. They're going to be doing hiring, special programs. And there are two things. One is you've got to figure out a way to spend this money within a set amount of time, because you don't have forever to spend it. And different pots of money, you have different timelines. But you want to ask yourself, what is something we can do in a one-time way that's going to make a huge difference for students? And then what can we use this money for that will set things up on an ongoing basis to continue to help students? It's a very difficult question. They are glad to have this challenge, but it is a really difficult question to answer, and it's an unusual one for us who've been reporting on people saying we never have enough money. So it should be an interesting time for that reason, among many others.
Will they seek any community input on this, do you think?
They're going to get it whether they seek it or not.
I know.
and they've already got it. There was a group earlier this week that included the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools, Community Coalition, Inner City Struggle, the Advancement Project. They already presented a plan for how they want the district to do it and to target the schools with the highest needs. Another group that includes collaboration with teachers unions came up with a prioritization plan. At the school board meeting on Tuesday, they had a presentation on how they hope to buttress the mental health of students. So there's a lot of ongoing discussion about this. And there are also all sorts of parent groups that both affiliated with the district, affiliated with different points of view, pro-teachers union, anti-teachers union. for engagement purposes, parents have some choices, and they've even started some of their own groups. A couple of groups of parents are suing the school district. So if you're a parent and you want to be engaged, you definitely have options.
Oh, well, thank you. Parents, pay attention. And now we want to hear from you, from viewers. There have been polls going on in the background, and you have been submitting questions. And so now we are going to turn it over to our audience engagement editor, Samantha Melbourne Weaver, and she's going to share some of your questions and share your responses to the survey. Samantha?
Hello.
Welcome. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for having me. Yes, we've got quite a few reader questions, which we'll get to in a second, but I want to start out with our first poll of the evening, which we shared out on Twitter. We asked our viewers, what's your top concern about schools reopening? We asked them, are you concerned about the risk of contracting coronavirus, or that it's not a good time to change family schedules, or whether you find coronavirus safety measures at school to be inadequate or excessive? And I think you'll see here that most of our viewers tonight are most concerned about the risk of their children contracting coronavirus or bringing coronavirus home. I think, Howard, you mentioned that a little bit, and you, Paloma, mentioning that risk. And I wonder if you can just kind of talk about different methods you've seen of people or school districts or teachers keeping people safe in that respect.
Paloma, you want to tackle that first?
Sure, yeah. One thing I thought was really interesting about that poll is sort of the almost equal numbers of people who feel like there's excessive safety measures and people who feel like there's inadequate safety measures. I think that's very telling about where we're at as a society in terms of these questions of return to school. And yeah, I would just say it's not surprising that people are still hold that concern. Even as experts have said that schools are safe to reopen as long as you take the adequate safety measures. Schools are taking pretty extensive safety measures. There's distancing. LAUSD and a lot of other districts are still maintaining a 6-foot distancing rule, even as experts have said that you can move to 3-foot distancing. So a lot of districts are still doing that. Howard talked a lot about the testing that's happening at LAUSD. It's happening at some other districts, but maybe not to the extent that it's happening at LAUSD. There's students have to, every morning, you have to fill out at LAUSD and other districts, you have to fill out a survey that says, do you have any symptoms? And you have to present that when you're going to school. There's sanitizing, there's cleaning of desks in between student groups. So there's mask wearing, obviously, that's being enforced at school. So there is quite a few safety measures that are being taken as schools reopen.
I just want to add that one thing that everyone has had to struggle with, both in school and among families, is the changing concepts of what's safe. And these things are going to continue to evolve. For example, at the beginning of this, we did not fully understand that this was an airborne disease. We thought this was a disease of surfaces. And so, not that people shouldn't wash their hands, but hand washing and cleaning surfaces is less important in comparison to the airflow in a room, for example, and ventilation. So masks continue to be important, and air filters. And there are a lot of systems in schools that is difficult to upgrade to the highest filtration. I don't think that's actually a problem in LA Unified, for example, because they spent a lot of money during this closure to upgrade their systems. But there are definitely school districts where this is an issue. And, the other thing is, there hasn't probably been enough about doing things outdoors, and we now know it's pretty safe, or at least much safer to be outdoors, and there hasn't been as much done to explore what can be done with outdoor learning. And another interesting example is, before the pandemic, people were moving away from hand sanitizers because it's a chemical, and people were saying hand sanitizer has no place in a classroom because children shouldn't be using chemicals. Well, now hand sanitizer is everywhere, so you have to literally pick your poison here. And that is the challenge that school districts, school leaders, and families have had to deal with. It isn't just making things safe, but it's these evolving concepts as we learn more about the virus and how it spreads from person to person.
Thank you.
That's really interesting. Yeah, we also asked our readers and our viewers about what it will take, where their students need the most help catching up after a year of at-home schooling or hybrid model. And an overwhelming number of people said the number one thing that their students need or their kids need to catch up is socializing. They also really said that there's a mental health counseling need, as well as your classic tutoring. So I wonder, maybe Howard, if you can talk about what's available to students, if anything, in the mental health realm, and then Sonia, maybe you have some thoughts about the socializing aspect and what it will take to catch kids up.
Well, there's going to be more. There's always been a debate about how much psychological counseling help is needed at schools, and certainly in areas that have higher numbers of low-income families, the need is greater. In these areas, there's often a lot of traumas that affect kids that aren't present in other areas. There was an interesting school board debate on Tuesday about whether to put a psychological social worker, someone who specializes in mental health issues, on every single campus, make sure that every elementary school had one. The debate was, well, maybe some don't, in some communities, they don't need one. And then another board member said, well, I think everybody needs at least one. Every campus needs at least one of these counselors in this situation, but maybe there are other campuses that need 2 and 3. So this debate is going on. There is money, at least for a time, to do this. And I'll stop there and let my colleagues jump in.
On the socializing part, I think, again, to go back to what I mentioned before about LAUSD's program, one really big benefit of having this essentially after-school program that runs actually for the majority of the school day for certainly elementary school kids and for more of the days for middle school kids, is that the folks who run those are the same folks who ran after-school programming pre-pandemic for the most part, and those folks are experts in this, right? They are already experts in what we now call social emotional learning. They are experts in getting kids to play together. And when I spoke to these folks, they talked to me about some of what they've already done. I mean, here's the other thing to understand: a lot of these community programs, like for example, the Boys and Girls Club, had remote learning hubs where they were providing childcare for almost the entire pandemic. They have been doing in-service work with children for almost the entire pandemic, and now are doing that through the schools. And that means that they actually have a lot of experience with helping kids come out of their shell, learn how to kind of share again and be with other children, learn how to connect, even despite having to keep this 6-foot distance and wearing a mask that covers your whole face. I have a preschooler, so the mask is literally like a ninja mask that goes to here. You can't see anybody's facial expressions, but the kids are pretty resilient for the most part. I mean, that's obviously going to be different for kids who have experienced a lot of trauma during the pandemic versus kids who have experienced less. But I think everybody is adjusting, and I've seen with my own son just being kind of anxious about being close to other people again, particularly kids you don't know. So I think a lot of that is just going to be physically being together again.
And Paloma, you've done a lot of reporting on this kind of widening gap in a lot of ways, academically, with language skills. What's your sense of really like what it's going to take to get kids back on track?
Yeah, I think it's such an important question. I think that a lot of the teachers and educators that I have talked to really feel, just like our audience that we polled, that priority number one right now doesn't need to be the math, doesn't need to be the English. It really needs to be that socializing and that mental health aspect for students. And I was in a classroom with a high school teacher earlier this week who, her motto for her algebra class is patience, grace, and let's try to learn a little math. It's sort of like, and she said, now is not the time to be grading students harshly. Now is not the time to be not giving them the opportunity to make up their work. We have to really understand that students have been through a lot at all levels. Some students certainly more who have lost more, but at all levels, students have struggled. And so I think that teachers are really aware of that need and are really trying to pay attention to it where they can.
And I'm reminded here to say that our colleague Laura Newberry has an upcoming story about the mental health issue and teachers and students dealing with it. So look forward to that one. That's a great one. I do want to pivot to a reader question. We have a young man named Jonathan Fratz who says he is a ninth grade autistic student attending an LA Unified school, and he's really worried about the services that he's been provided. He's got an IEP, which I think probably Howard can explain for those who don't know. And it's just been really difficult for him to deal with not being close to an aide and not being in person to get a lot of the help that he needs. And so he asks about this extension. I've heard about extending the school year by 10 days, 6 of which are for student instruction. How is this going to help make up for what we've lost in the past year during the pandemic? I open that to all of you.
Well, hey, Jonathan. I've interviewed Jonathan before. He is a very he has an IEP and technically is a disability, but boy, this guy is a go-getter. And I think so. What he raises is, what concrete are we doing? I mean, there are a couple of issues raised, right? One is that the students with special needs, and Paloma has done some great reporting on this, and Sonali Kohli, who is on a fellowship leave, she did some great reporting on the special needs students with disabilities. And these students have suffered particularly during the pandemic because services that are more effective in person have not been available. And in some cases, even online services are not available. So it does remain to be seen how the district will compensate for this. A longer school year might help, but it depends on what they do with a longer school year. Ironically, a longer school year is very controversial. A lot of parents do not want that, or they want it to be optional. And these are the kind of debates we're having right now over how to spend these literally billions of dollars in funds. And you also have to find these people and hire them to provide these services. I'm sure my colleagues have some thoughts on this as well.
I just want to jump in if I can. I'm disabled, and I grew up with a 504 plan, which is kind of like the complement if you don't quite need an IEP, but you have other limitations, get a 504. And what we know as disabled students, right, is that disabled students have never gotten what they were supposed to get from schools ever. So kids with disabilities are already coming in with a disadvantage, and getting kids back up to speed is not merely about getting them enough hours or getting them the access to the free appropriate public education that they're entitled to, whether it's the aids or other kinds of services. It's also about evaluations, which were delayed a great deal during the pandemic because people's needs evolve and they change as they grow older, or they get certain needs that they didn't have before. And those legally are supposed to be evaluated every single year, and the plan is supposed to be built around those evaluations. And a lot of that didn't happen. So it's not merely kind of catching up to where folks were supposed to be, but actually, figuring out where they need to be now, which for a lot of disabled students, especially after this year, where they were getting even fewer of the services that they were entitled to, is going to be a much bigger race.
We also have a question from a viewer on Facebook, Lynn Walton, who brings up high achieving students. She says that students in AP classes are frustrated at the hybrid model and not having their teachers' full attention, especially leading up to AP tests. And so I wonder if you guys can talk about sort of the opposite end of the spectrum and how this is affecting high achieving students.
Well, this underscores that all students have special needs, and there isn't any student out there that isn't unique and special and have needs. And this certainly applies to students who are ready for accelerated learning. And there is a small number of students who've actually thrived in distance learning because they've been able to move far ahead without impediments that they might normally have. So good, congratulations to them. But it goes back to the point that my colleagues were making about socialization and mental health. I think Paloma was talking about that a lot of this is enrichment, right? So I was at a school yesterday, Pacoima Middle School. Great, it looks like a great school, a dynamic principal, great teachers. They have a wonderful dance studio, but nobody was using it. The teacher was teaching a dance class, and the students were at home. Now, Austin Butner came, the superintendent, and he gamely tried some dance moves there. So compliments to him for giving that a try. But we need to get this enrichment, and it's that enrichment that often pulls students in and makes them want to go to school. Some students go to school not because of academics, but because they get to do sports. At Pacoima Middle School, they normally have a chess club. That's amazing. That's great. But the chess club hasn't found a way to get started yet in this environment. At Garfield High, they're doing school dances online just to keep some of that going, that enrichment going. And students are literally dancing in their own room at a school dance. So all of these things that add enrichment, because indeed all students are special and they all have special needs. And this certainly applies to those who are ready to academically accelerate. And just like the pandemic has exacerbated things that have always existed, for all of these students, the system, as all systems do, they have trouble responding to the needs of individual students in an effective way. And one of the big questions is, can we emerge from this crisis with a better school system than we had before? There are some people who think we can. That would be great if it turns out that way.
Well, I want to hear more about these Garfield High students, Howard. That takes a lot of confidence to dance by yourself on TV. But thank you for that great answer. I want to turn to our third and final poll question, which we asked our viewers about the hybrid teaching model. And we asked how it's going. And you think you'll be able to see here in a second that a lot of people are pretty frustrated by how it's going. A couple people are really in the groove, really used to this process, and some people are so new to it that they don't have an opinion yet. But 52% said it's frustrating and inadequate. Howard, you mentioned the return, but I wonder if, when we return to school in the fall, how the goal is 5 days a week. But I wonder if that's realistic and what parents will think about it. And then I want to hear from you, Paloma, on how this will affect the student performance.
Oh, well, Paloma, you go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I haven't spoken to anybody who says that the hybrid model is an ideal one or a good one. Even, it's sort of the way that schools are trying to balance these issues of safety and getting kids back in the classroom. I was in a lot of classrooms earlier this week and last week where teachers are simultaneously teaching online and in person at the same time. So they have their math class, and half of the students are in person in front of them and half of them are online. And that is an incredible challenge as well, where they're trying to teach to the computer, but they're also trying to speak with the kids who are in person. So, the different models that districts have adopted, they, for the most part, all have their challenges and all make for a very, very different school environment than the one that, we were used to before the pandemic, where students are just in person, they can do their extracurriculars, they can go to choir practice and band practice and all of that. It's different, and I don't think anyone sort of is arguing that it's ideal or it's something to aspire to. And yeah, I think that the hope for a lot of school districts in the fall is to get back to a 5 day a week in-person model. And sort of with all things with this pandemic, we don't know. Things change, so we don't know exactly how it's going to play. But I think that's the goal for a lot of districts.
I think if we don't get to that, there's going to be a lot of parent anger in certain quarters. But suffice to say, there are also parents who their paramount concern is safety. And it's funny, you speak to parents who are saying we've got to do more, and then you speak to parents who say we've got to be more safe, and they cannot conceive that anybody feels differently than they do. But there is a lot of diverse opinion out there, and I think Paloma expressed that dynamic very well.
I wonder too, Paloma, if you can talk about how distance learning and the hybrid model affects lower income families who seem to have still struggled even after the district handed out computers and Wi-Fi hotspots, and just what's that been like?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many challenges that continue to exist, even if you get a laptop in your hand, right? One of the biggest challenges is Wi-Fi. So even if you have like a wireless device that the district gave out, sometimes they don't work. In certain communities, they don't work, and the district has tried to, have to find the right provider for the right community, and in some cases they still are inadequate. In a lot of cases, if you live in a crowded home, if you live in a one-bedroom apartment with two siblings and you're trying to do your schooling at home, and you have little ones there that are trying to do their schooling, or toddlers who are distracting you, like that's an incredible challenge. I talked to a high school teacher earlier this week who talked about how one of his students was changing diapers in the middle of class because they're taking care of their siblings. And that's a common theme that I've heard from a lot of teachers this year, is that the burden for taking care of younger siblings is falling on older ones, sometimes even eighth graders. Students in middle school are taking care of their younger siblings. And so how do you learn in that environment? It's just an incredible challenge.
I have to say, though, too, it is in some ways for the teachers to be able to see this and to see the challenges that their students face at home could be a productive thing that comes out of this. And the teachers are working awfully hard. I mean, we haven't talked about them very much, but I don't know a teacher who wouldn't have rather been in the classroom rather than doing online learning this year. And I'm sure the hybrid model is not, suitable for them either. But it has, in some ways, created this kind of intimacy in an odd way between teacher and student, because you're in each other's homes. And I hope that in some ways the teachers can take the information they've learned about how their children, their students, the struggles that they go through, and how much strength and energy it takes sometimes to do basic things. I hope that's a good thing that comes out of this. All right. Well, Sam, thank you very much for the polling. That was
thank you all.
fascinating.
Thank you to all the viewers for all of your questions.
Yes, and thank you to our wonderful panel. Thank you, Paloma and Howard and Sonia. There's a lot of knowledge in that team there, and we look forward to reading your stories on some of the things we talked about tonight. And I want to thank you all for joining and for participating in this. And we will be doing this again, and hope you come back. And please do sign up for 8 to 3, the newsletter. And we look forward to doing this again. So thank you guys, and good night.
Thank you.